Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, something I love doing on the show is finding historical figures that haven't been well documented until now, or talking with book authors who've done that very task. And in today's episode, we're going to be speaking with Sonia Purnell, who's the author of the book A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II. Her book is about Virginia Hall, and there was a message that the Gestapo sent about her in 1942. It said, "She is the most dangerous of all Allied spies. We must find and destroy her." This was an American woman who was rejected from the Foreign Service because she was female, and there were few in the Foreign Service at that time, but most importantly because of her prosthetic leg. She had become an amputee at the age of 27. But she managed to talk her way behind enemy lines in occupied France and wanted to become one of the greatest and most unlikely spies in American history. Virginia Hall was a charming and ambitious daughter of wealth. She ignored her parents' wish for her to settle down and marry rich. Instead, she pursued a career in diplomatic service. But she lost her leg at the age of 27 in a hunting accident and crushed her career aspirations. Despite that, she made her way to the front lines of World War II, first by driving ambulances for the French army, and then by joining the British spy division called the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, the SOE. And in an insane gamble, the one-legged 35-year-old was dropped into occupied France, and she laid down the earliest networks of the French resistance. And she would find pockets of resistance in the most unlikely places. First finding nuns at a convent who wanted to support her, then actually going to a brothel and finding prostitutes who were willing to knowingly infect German officers. So she set up a network of spies to blow up bridges and track German troop movements, recruiting and training guerrilla fighters, arming them with weapons. And later, she was called the Madonna of the Mountains because she would come, and then shortly afterwards, there would be aerial convoy supply drops to villagers who would give them weapons, give them other food necessities that they needed. She's still an oral legend in parts of France, and that might be because wanted posters of her were covered all over the region of the Pyrenees. So there's a lot to unpack in this episode, and I hope you enjoy this discussion with Sonia Purnell. Sonia, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for being here.
First of all, I'm curious about the title of your book, A Woman of No Importance. Where exactly does that title come from originally?
Well, for a long time, that was how she was treated. She'd picked up a raft of qualifications and languages. She'd applied to the State Department to join the diplomatic service. It just never seemed to happen. She kept being kind of rejected. So she would apply again, and this time she would do really well in the examinations. But this time she was rejected because she was an amputee. It was an obscure rule, whereas there seemed to be quite a few male amputees from the First World War who hadn't received that treatment. But she was dismissed by Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, himself as really a woman of no importance, to sort of, paraphrase what he said. And FDR was involved at this point, because she had fairly important friends lobbying on her behalf, and he asked Cordell Hull for a briefing on it, and Cordell Hull comes back and says, yeah, she might make a fine career girl in the clerical grades. So again and again, she was kind of treated as no one in particular. She was filing documents and answering the phone when Europe was spinning towards war. And she wanted to take an active role. That's all she wanted to do. And in the end, she resigned from the State Department and ended up with the first thing that she did in the war effort was driving ambulances on the front line for the French army when the Germans invaded. So, she was beginning to prove herself as being a woman of some importance. And then, of course, the Gestapo thought she was very important, and they said that she was the most dangerous Allied spy of all. And there was some competition for that label, believe me, and said that we must find and destroy her. So, in a sense, the title is an ironic one. It was how she was often treated before the war and actually after it. But during the war, she proved that she was a very important woman indeed. In fact, the secret documents that I managed to unearth describe her as having saved Allied intelligence in France almost single-handedly from, quote, extinction. So, I'm just kind of painting a contrast between how she was often treated to the intense achievements that she pulled off in the end.
I'm very curious, for someone like her who did such remarkable work and when she's an amputee, that just amplifies it that much more. Why do you think we haven't heard much about her until now when there are other women involved in the resistance, like Nancy Wake, who's been openly and publicly celebrated, I think, since at least the 70s? Why do you think Virginia Hall is relatively unknown until now?
I think partly because she didn't fit that kind of conventional idea of feminine beauty. She was an amputee. She was an extremely glamorous woman, don't get me wrong. But, this was at a time when disabled people were not expected to lead such adventurous lives. Perhaps they're still not even now. And so she didn't fit that sort of conventional narrative. And the other narrative after the war were those women who had died, that sort of noble sacrifice, often before they'd really achieved very much. Courageous as they were, they would go to concentration camps and be executed, but they hadn't really achieved very much. That was another common narrative. Virginia kind of, she didn't fit into any of these boxes, but nor did she talk about herself. She went on to work for the CIA after the war and shunned publicity. She was decorated by the French Republic, by a British king and an American president, but always in secret. She achieved enormous amounts, but often if you look at the war, those who achieved the most spoke the least. And I think Virginia was one of those. And even when I was researching the book, or very much when I was researching the book, it felt a bit like she was playing cat and mouse with me now, even though she's been dead since 1982. I would go down a really promising lead and then come across, a dark alleyway, and those papers had mysteriously been mislaid or destroyed. This happened quite a lot. Unfortunately, often I found another way to sort of solve that mystery. But hey, she really likes to make it difficult, even now, to find out about her. But I just felt her story was so strong, so spectacular, it had to be told.
Believe it or not, my audience likes historiography and tracking down sources. For you, were a number of sources only recently declassified, or did you have to find another method of figuring out her story?
Well, I was very lucky to find two former intelligence officers on both sides of the Atlantic, so over here in the US, where I live in the UK, who were able to help me declassify certain documents, which were really useful in filling in some of those gaps, that appear in a story like this. Because, of course, secret agents do not sit down at the end of the day and write their diaries, make our lives a little bit more difficult than that. So that was one lucky break. Also, I speak French. I don't think this would have been possible without being able to speak French. And I found in this very, very dusty archive in Lyon, the city in the southeast of France, a resistance archive. The trolley was literally covered in sort of like an inch of dust. But it had lots of papers pulled together by someone who'd fought alongside her in the war. And he'd done this quite quickly after the war, where people were still alive and before a lot of these documents mysteriously disappeared. And he'd taken copies. He made my life possible and this story possible. So some of those documents he'd made copies of, there they were on this file, on this trolley I'd tracked down. And there were also wonderful things on that trolley. These letters that some of the men who'd fought alongside her in 1944, after D-Day, who'd helped to liberate a whole department of France with her, and who wrote to each other about her, and in various different ways said the same thing, which really struck me, which was that it had been worth being born just to have met and fought alongside Virginia Hall. And so I was starting to get this personal impression of her, this impact that she had on people, which was just astounding. She really did. She's a legend in that part of France, by the way, even now.
Really interesting. In, I guess, an oral tradition or people telling stories about her?
People telling stories about her. So when I contacted the town halls, it was up in the Haute-Loire, it was like a big plateau, also in southern France. And I wanted to go there because this is where she did a lot of fighting, and she brought in 22 parachute drops of guns and ammunition and actually chocolate and other essentials. And these were people who'd previously been fighting pretty much with broomsticks. They had nothing, and the Germans were laying waste to their farmsteads. And they were also, by the way, hiding a lot of Jews up there. They were really brave people, and they were awarded the Righteous Amongst the Nations honor from the State of Israel, the only part of France to be so. So she was up there. I went to investigate and do some research. The deputy mayor almost put the red carpet on for me. I met so many people who drove me around the plateau, who wanted to tell me the reminiscences that they had heard when they were kids. They took me to all the sites of the parachute drops. And they all used this phrase about her, which they had heard from their fathers, their uncles, their grandfathers and things, and that was les étoiles dans les yeux, which means stars in their eyes. And they just thought of her, they called her the Madonna of the mountains, because she had rescued them almost as if by miracle. Because when she turned up, these great big Halifax bombers turned up, but they didn't drop bombs, they dropped these containers with all these vital guns and ammunition and so on. So, and they still talk about her in that way now. And the widow of one of the guys who fought with her has devoted an entire room in her house to what were known as the Diane Irregulars, Diane being Virginia's code name, and the Irregulars being her little army. And it was almost like a shrine, and they also have this little museum there. So it was a really amazing and revelatory trip there that they still talk about her so much. And as soon as I said I'd like to research Virginia Hall, the whole kind of place, almost put the bunting out. They just wanted to talk about her and make sure that her story gets out to the rest of the world.
Well, I suppose we should establish things properly and get into her background. What happened in her background that made her want to get into espionage and guerrilla warfare?
Yeah, well, good question. Well, she was born to a well-to-do family in Baltimore. They didn't have quite as much money as they had done once, and her mother very much hoped that she would make an advantageous match, would marry a well-heeled young man. But Virginia always had very different ideas. She was a tomboy. She just had adventure running through her veins. In fact, her grandfather had run away to sea at the age of 9, so maybe it was in the DNA or something. But, she went into school once with a bracelet made out of live snakes, so she was pretty different from everybody else. She then went to study abroad in Paris in the 1920s and just really loved it, loved meeting different people from all different walks of life, and decided she wanted to be an ambassador but kept being turned down. So she went into the State Department as a desk clerk, and then had this terrible accident when she was hunting in Turkey one day, where she literally shot herself in the foot. So this beautiful, adventurous young woman nearly dies from gangrene. The only way to save her life is to cut her leg off below the knee, her left leg. So she was 27 then, and prosthetics were pretty rudimentary, believe me, and hers had to be held onto her with some leather straps around her waist that used to chafe and bite into her skin and things. But somehow she's not going to let this stop her. She finds ways around her disability. She finds ways to still be useful. She is spectacularly good at her job. But her promotion is denied because she is an amputee. Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, cites some obscure rule barring amputees from the diplomatic service, even though there are various male amputees working as diplomats. So she experiences frustration, rejection, humiliation even. She's incredibly well qualified to be a diplomat, speaks several languages, has studied abroad, knows a lot about European politics. So she resigns and then starts driving these ambulances and then becomes a secret agent. And do you know what I think? Being an amputee, having suffered what she suffered, and she did suffer greatly, she was never not in pain ever again for a single day of her life, but that made her very self-reliant. A lot of the spies who were caught, the secret agents who were caught during the war, was because they couldn't keep themselves to themselves. They just felt compelled to try and share what they were doing with someone else. Virginia didn't feel that. She had become used to being entirely self-reliant and to keep a little distance from people. And I think that did help her. After all, she had already come through a great battle. She had already survived, a very much near-death experience. And so in a way, she had a kind of training that others didn't have. And I think it's arguable that her disability helped make her a very great agent. It certainly did not hold her back in any way. And it was interesting. I gave a lecture the other night in Boston, and three amazing people turned up with